Hello, everybody.
Only lies cast in a face. There's not one truth cast in a stone.
This is the Cast in Stone podcast.
Only lies cast in a flame. It's time to burn.
I am Bo.
It's time to burn.
Okay, here we go. Episode 2 of the Casts in Stone podcast. My name is Bo. I want to thank everybody for coming back or checking it out for the first time, if this is indeed your first time. Just wanted to get some silly stuff out of the way. Apologies for the editing in the first episode. I know it was choppy a bit and a little wonky at times. That was my first attempt, so this is going to be my second try, and I think it'll be better. I'm going to try my best, but I had to edit so many uhs and ums and likes out of that first episode that it got a little choppy. This time will be better. I want to thank you for the patience. I originally thought that I would be able to do this once a month, and that first subject matter I already knew quite a bit about, so I did feel as though that was realistic. Then I started researching for this one and wanting to be due diligent, wanting to be thorough and interesting. I realized there's no way we're going to be able to do this every month. So every 2 to 3 months, I think, is more realistic. And so that will be the schedule you can expect moving forward. And I had a few sources that I used for this. One is called The Witches by Stacy Schiff. Good book. And another really good one was The Six Women of Salem by Marilyn K. Roach. Those are the two main ones. There's some other witchcraft in Europe ones that I was reading, and the Malleus Maleficarum by Heinrich Kramer. I also was perusing, but it's like impossible to read. It's asinine. Another big tool and helpful source for me was an incredible podcast called Unobscured by Aaron Mahnke. It's a 12-part main story plus 7 like appendices of about 40 to 60 minutes each. So 19 almost hour-long episodes is the first season. It's all about Salem. It is absolutely stunningly incredible. It's just a bit more in-depth than I think the average person might want. However, if we get done with this and you're interested, check out Unobscured by Aaron Mahnke. It's the very first season is all about Salem. It's fantastic. It's really amazing. It's one of those things where I was like almost done with the research for this and then found that and went, oh, and then had so much more to get into. As I said in the previous episode, the dominoes of history are really tricky. They're particularly tricky with something like this that doesn't really have a first domino. They're all connected, and that's how history is. But with this one in particular, I really had to pick a starting point, and we're going to get right into it. But just so you know, witchcraft is one of the oldest things in the world, right? The suspicion of witchcraft is one of the oldest things that exists. So there really isn't, a great starting point for this, but you'll see where we're starting. So, just like the previous episode, I'm going to go through introducing people as they come. I will go through everybody as they exit the movie. Let's all settle in. I don't know if you're at work, on your way to work, at home. It's dark out here. It's hot as balls in Chicago, 95 degrees. And I don't have the AC on in this room because I want you guys to have an enjoyable experience. So I will be melting in front of you before your very eyes and ears. Let's crack open a nice cold Diet Dr. Pepper. Let's buckle up and get ready for this. Light a candle. Fall is right around the corner. It's cold is coming. We're going to pretend, and let's get into it. The first spot that I decided to start with this whole thing is the institutionalized effort of rumors and lies and gossip and taking that and weaponizing it. So we're going to start with the Spanish Inquisition very quick. Again, this is the first domino that I'm picking. It's not necessarily the correct first one. This started in the late 1400s by a couple of people you might recognize or remember if you listen to the first episode. In Spain, it was started by the Catholic monarchs in 1478, King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile. And guess what? Those are the same two fuckers who set Columbus and Cortez to the New World. Complete coincidence. I did not plan that. I had no idea. Then I read into it and I realized, oh, there's like a through thread. That's cool. That's fun. The Inquisition was originally intended as a way to identify heretics, particularly of Muslim or Jewish people who converted conversos into Catholics. Okay. Someone would report on something about someone not being a good Catholic or about someone not practicing Catholicism the way that they believed. The Inquisition would grab that person, torture them, get them to confess. They would parade the accused around publicly and announce their charges. And then once they had whatever information they wanted, they handed that accused person off to the local authorities, which is interesting. So they weren't necessarily, they were conducting horrible torture and treatment of people, but they didn't really have the authority to condemn someone. They just kind of gathered information and then took care of it. There were two other major inquisitions in between the late 1400s and the early 1800s. The Roman Inquisition and the Portuguese Inquisition. About 150,000 people total were accused, which ended up in about 3,000 to 5,000 people executed by the state, most of whom were burned alive. Some were burned after being beheaded. At the same time, this is just kind of a side note, between 40,000 to 100,000 Jewish people were expelled in 1492 from the Spanish Empire as well. Contrary to popular belief, although it was a common punishment in Europe, no one was ever burned at the stake in America. That is a misconception. So that's all based around the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And we're going to move into a different area of the world. Same time period, though. The one key figure in this, and I had no idea he was necessarily, quote unquote, responsible for starting what this all was, is King Henry VIII. Who knew that this bastard, who was a tyrant, who killed several people, including his own wives, and annulled marriages and did all this horrible stuff, was responsible, was again another domino in the line getting to what we're going to end up talking about today. Henry, he was a bastard. He was second in line or third in line. He had an older brother who died, Arthur, who died most likely of tuberculosis. All the princely duties fell to Henry VII, who then also died. And then at 17, Henry VIII took over and said he would marry the widow of Arthur, whose name is Catherine, whose parents were Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Yet another connection to the two monarchs who sent Cortez to the New World and Columbus to the New World and all the stuff we talked about in the last episode. Had no idea when I started this. Catherine was unable to give birth to a living child. She had 5 to 6 stillburns. One boy who did live but died after a few weeks, and then finally a girl who did survive named Mary. He wanted to get out of that marriage in order to get himself an heir. He didn't have an heir, right? So he decided, I need to have my marriage annulled, which was illegal. No can do. But in 1527, Henry VIII was desperate for his heir, and he asked the Pope at the time, Clement VII, to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The Pope refused, and Henry then used Parliament to assert royal authority over the English Church. So in 1533, Parliament passed the Act in restraint of appeals, barring legal cases from being appealed outside of England. So anything that was brought to Parliament to an English court had to be handled in England, and that allowed the Archbishop of Canterbury to annul the marriage without reference to Rome. In November of 1534, the Act of Supremacy formally abolished papal authority and declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. So the Church of England already existed. Henry kind of grabbed a hold of it. He was a de facto leader of the Church of England as the King of England. He reformed it in order to do what he wanted to do. What this did was removed Anglican and Protestant church away from Roman Catholic Church, away from the Pope's authority. Okay. Puritans eventually came around, and they were English Protestants who wanted to rid themselves of the Church of England because they thought the Church of England wasn't reformed enough. It wasn't their own thing enough. They wanted more. They were more conservative. They were wanting to be more Protestant in that they had the minister and they could talk to God. They could pray. They didn't need clergy to talk to God. This is one of the major differences between the two churches. The Puritans slowly gained steam through the 1600s and mid 1600s. They were radical in their beliefs. Some wanted a great uniform nation of Puritans, so people who all dressed like the Pilgrims that we know. Eventually, most people just wanted kind of their own separatist churches. They wanted to be able to practice their religion alone and not be influenced by a governing body. They wanted to practice their religion. Between 1629 and 1640, which was called the 11 Years' Tyranny under King Charles I of England, many Puritans decided to leave for New England. Okay, let's talk about New England. This just kind of will set a cool tone for what we're going to talk about. The first British, right, I should say English settlement attempt was in 1585 in Roanoke off the coast of North Carolina. The second, which was more well-known because the first one was just abandoned right away. The second one, which is the Roanoke settlement, also known as the Lost Colony, started in 1587 with a guy named John White getting the charter, having the permission from the crown to start an actual settlement. There were already forts. There were already places where there were English and European settlers and colonists, or not colonists, colonizers, but there was not an English settlement yet. Sir Walter Raleigh of Raleigh, North Carolina, approved this attempt, the first two, in fact, and he approved the founding of the city of Raleigh in Chesapeake Bay. The first expedition consisted of 3 ships, the flagship called Lion, a flyboat, and a full-rigged pinnace. I'm not sure how to say it. The expedition arrived at Croatoan Island, where they expected to find one of these forts, 15 men they thought were going to be stationed there already by Sir Richard Grenville. They found that the fort was abandoned and there were human bones strewn all about. So creepy, scary already. They thought they were going to find 15 guys who probably needed resupply, but who would know the land and know how to survive. They found a bunch of bones and no one alive. They stuck around there and kind of moved into the fort, into Grenville, because it's there and they had to get off that damn ship. A man named George Howard was killed by natives while searching for crabs shortly thereafter. The local tribe in that area were the Croatan, who explained that there was a mainland coalition of native tribes led by the Wanchese, I think, and they had attacked Grenville's fort. The settlers said, okay, thank you for telling us. Can we establish a truce with you? We'll trade with you so that we can protect ourselves from this alliance. And they said, nah, we're good. That fella, John White, who was leading the charter, he decided to take some of the men, take some weapons, and kind of search. They went to where they believed people and natives from that coalition were kind of hiding and laying in wait, and when attacked and killed a bunch, only to find that it was actually the Croatan who were kind of picking through what was left over in this nearby, another kind of settlement fort. So just really They're just fumbling this whole beginning in the new world, trying to create a permanent settlement. Also, just a tidbit: on August 18th, 818 day, 1587, the first English settler gave birth to a girl named Virginia Dare. So that was the first person from the Kingdom of England born in New England. Things are not going great for these settlers in Roanoke. In August 27th, 1587, just a few days after Virginia was born, the settlers begged White to go back to England, get more supplies, get some more assistance, and then to come back to help them. It took about 60 days for them to get there, so they figured, okay, I'll take 60 days back, probably take a couple months there, and then 60 days to get back to the New World. So about 6 months, right, is what they're assuming. 6 months to a year, right? So indeed, he left in late August. He got back to England in early November. However, there was a war going on between Spain and England, and the Spanish Armada was threatening to take over the English islands. So Queen Elizabeth did not let anyone leave. May of the following year, he did kind of get onto 2 ships, and he was going to go back and resupply, but the ships weren't manned by people who were caring about some rescue mission of some poor settlers on the other side of the world. They're trying to make money. So they attempted to attack Spanish vessels, and then they were later attacked by French mariners who took all the supplies that they were going to bring to Roanoke, and then they had to go back anyway. August 12th, 1590, the Hope and the Moonlight are finally off the coast of Roanoke. So White was not allowed to make another attempt until 1590. And he had passage on a privateering expedition, basically legal pirates, in a fleet of 6 ships, 2 of which, the Hope and Moonlight, were going to break off, return to the colony, and do what he needed to do, and then the 4 others would continue doing pirate stuff, I guess. On August 18th, 1590, that is 3 years to the day of Virginia Dare being born, which is crazy, who, by the way, was Jim White's granddaughter. So 3 years after his granddaughter was born in the New World, White and the others made landfall. They found fresh tracks in the sand, but they saw no one. They've made contact with no one. They discovered the letter CRO carved into a tree nearby, and then on a pole even nearer, they found Croatoan carved into this clearly by a knife in English in this pole. White was sure that this was an indication that the colonists had relocated from Roanoke Island to Croatoan Island. And as they searched around Roanoke, they realized that everything that had been there that could be removed was removed. So from building foundations and supplies and anything that was left, they took it all. Everything was gone. There was no one there. The ships were unable themselves to go to Croatoan Island because one snapped an anchor line immediately, and then there were poor winds while trying to get there. It's kind of confusing to read, but basically, both ships returned to England October 24th, 1590. No one from there was ever seen again. So there's a few theories. A, that they were taken prisoner by natives. B, that they just went into the wilderness inland. And there's some people who think aliens got them. Whatever. It's a scary story that the first attempt did not go well and everybody was lost. May 14th, 1607. So quite a bit after Roanoke. Jamestown was founded by English people from Blackwall, London. The Godspeed, the Susan Constant, and the Discovery were the 3 ships that went to Jamestown. The area was picked because cartographers believed that on the other side of Chesapeake Bay or the other side of James Bay, whatever it is, the Pacific Ocean was over there. And so they thought it would be they thought it was Panama, essentially, but it was actually off of the coast of Virginia. Members of this new colony were sent with a sealed document by the English government that outlined roles for everyone who is like for what they had to do once they get there, because they were so concerned about just functioning in this new world that is how fragile everything was. You had to be told what to do. There were lots of contacts and hostilities with natives, which caused a lot of disagreements between settlers. People wanted to break off. People wanted to do their own thing because they didn't like what was going on. In June 1607, settlers are starving and succumbing to illness. Chief Powhatan, or Powhatan, sent corn and venison to help them, which was obviously a kindness, but that wasn't always his thing. There were lots of ambushes and attacks that he led. He was one of the guys who was involved in the whole Pocahontas and John Smith story. John Smith was a part of this group that was at Jamestown at this time. By January 1608, so about 6 months later, 40 of the initial 150 colonists were left alive. So it's about 70%, I think, died. Early January that same year, a second arrival of 60 to 100 new people arrived, but supplies aren't arriving. There was also in January a major fire. I'm just kind of going through the tragedies that these people endured, and there's a point to it once I get to the end of this. There was a major fire that happened in January, and they just didn't have any supplies, so they had to live in the rubble of burned down buildings for the rest of the winter, just in burned open buildings in the Virginia winter. In October 1609, which is quite a jump, 350 colonists arrived, but without any supplies whatsoever. That following November, John Ratcliffe, who was governor at the time, and governor in English colonial times, the governor is head honcho. He's the boss. He gets permission from the crown. He has correspondence with Parliament and the crown, and what he says goes. So John Ratcliffe, who, if you have seen Pocahontas, the Disney movie, he's the scary like governor guy in the pink with the real ugly face. That's John Ratcliffe. He was the governor. He's one of the initial captains of one of the ship. He got captured by the Powhatan people. He got stripped, and using the shells of mussels, like mussel seafood, the women of the Powhatan tribe flayed him alive while he was tied to something, saving his face so that he would remain conscious during the whole thing. And then they burned him alive at the stake after he traded with them. So the reason I even bring that up is think about the bedtime stories. Think about the ghost stories. Think about the constant fear that you're never safe. That even your leader, essentially the president of this colony that they're trying to set up, got captured, brutally murdered, and burnt at the stake. That same November into June the following year, 1610, was what's called the starving time, which began with 500 people and ended with roughly 61 people remaining alive. So in a 7-month period, 439 people died. Part of the problem was the settlers didn't plan to grow all their own food, and they planned on trading, but with all the hostilities and with more people coming without bringing more supplies, it gets harder and harder and harder to maintain. Eventually, I mean, people even abandoned Jamestown altogether, but they were discovered as they were leaving by a supply convoy that did make it. They resupplied. And then a guy named John Rolfe secured the success of the settlement with the commercialization of the tobacco plant, saving the colony. That's a pretty huge thing because it also gets us into another territory that's a little uncomfortable to talk about, but it's part of the story. Before that, though, really quick, we need to talk about the Pilgrims, because the Pilgrims of Plymouth Rock are directly connected to Salem and to what the main topic is. The Puritans, who would go to be known as the Pilgrims, they left England for Leiden in the Netherlands for a little while, and then they got a patent from the Mayflower Company, or from Plymouth Company, rather, to leave on the Mayflower for Plymouth Rock. They arrived December 1620, and they established Plymouth Colony after a 66-day journey from England to Massachusetts. Two of the settlers who were part of this group of pilgrims, they got a patent from the Dorchester Company in Cape Ann, and they used that. A guy named Roger Conant led a group of fishermen north a bit and founded Salem in 1626. So you go from December 1620, when the Pilgrims get there, to 1626. That's when Salem is actually founded. In 1630, The first ships of the Great Puritan Migration sailed to the New World, and they were led by John Winthrop. John Winthrop is kind of the godfather of all the Puritan migration stuff. He's a very popular name. About from 1629 to 1643, about 20,000 Puritans immigrated to New England. Something that's interesting, and again, I know I said that they were looking for something more conservative and less Roman Catholic in what and how they wanted to practice their religion, but they weren't. It's funny, they didn't necessarily want to create a theocratic government. They didn't want a theocracy, but they also didn't necessarily care about people being able to practice any religion they wanted. It was kind of, you can do whatever you want as long as we say so. That's kind of, so like Quakers and Jesuits, Puritans hated them. I don't even know what that means, but that is how it went. They wanted to separate themselves most of all and practice their brand, their flavor of Puritanism where they could practice it. Little tidbit about all this stuff. I don't know if you guys have ever looked any of this up, but reading the YouTube comments on the Mayflower or the Pilgrims or Jamestown or Salem or any of this stuff is some of the most brutal, punishing comment sections I've ever read through. Everyone's got a relative. Everyone's got a story. It is so annoying. Check that out if you ever want to steam a little bit. Like I said, in 1626, Salem, the settlement of Salem, initially called Namkeeg, was founded by Roger Conant, and that is a separation of the Massachusetts Bay settlement on Plymouth Rock and Cape Ann. He's an original pilgrim. So Salem was like, boom, it's just an offshoot of the original pilgrim voyage. The name Salem, also, if you look at it, you put Jeru in front of Salem, you have Jerusalem. Pretty interesting. I've always thought that was cool. In 1639, so quite a bit after, the first church of Salem was founded, and it is the original Puritan church in America. It's the first one to follow this particular form of Puritanism and Calvinism and Protestantism and all this other ism stuff. We had two Salems. Salem town was the port. It was a little busier, more focused on business, hustle and bustle. There were taverns. There were blacksmiths. There were trades of all kinds in the port. And then you have Salem Village, which is more agricultural and farmland. You have the more conservative folk, the more God-fearing folk out in the farmland in Salem Village, and Salem town is more based around business. The port was a major component to the 17th and 18th century slave trade that was happening at the time. So what would happen was textiles, rum, and other various goods would go from England to Africa. Slaves were captured, taken from Africa to the Americas in exchange for sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which then went back to Europe. And this is a triangular trade route that happened. For a while, Salem was busier than the port of Boston. Salem was a huge port, and this was an important thing. Salem Village, the more farmland one, is modern-day Danvers in Massachusetts. And like I said, they disagreed with Salem Town in the prioritization of business over godliness. Salem Village was more conservative. They were a little more fascistic, in my opinion. They wanted to do their own thing. So they started practicing their own church. They started hiring their own ministers. The first minister was a guy named James Bailey. The second minister was a guy named George Burroughs. Both of them would eventually quit very shortly after being hired because they were not paid. And in June 18th, 1689, so we're moving. Okay, we moved quite a bit through time. A guy named Samuel Parris was hired and ordained as the Salem Village minister. However, within 2 years, he'd be running into money issues as well. Now we can kind of get into the actual topic. These Puritans were so God-fearing and so afraid to disagree with, say, the Bible or with what the devil could do or what angels could do or demons could do or whatever, that being superstitious, believing in witchcraft, believing in magic was the same as believing in God. If you were to deny that a witch was a possibility, a real thing, you were kind of denying that the devil had minions, which then kind of meant you were denying that God existed somehow. Like that's the train of thought, which is crazy. Puritan belief in this Puritan society was interesting because women were important and women were respected and they were listened to. However, the society was just inherently misogynistic. Puritan belief was that women were inherently sinful and more susceptible to damnation than men, according to Elizabeth Reese in Damned Women, Sinners, and Witches in Puritan New England. Men and women were equal in the eyes of God, but not in the eyes of the devil. I'm going to say that again because I think that's crazy. Men and women were equal in the eyes of God, but not in the eyes of the devil. So we're already like all these perfect little pieces are going to start coming together for this story. What is witchcraft? What does that even mean? Witchcraft and magic are as old as ancient Mesopotamia. There's records of witches and magic and stuff being used 6,000 BC. 6,000 BC. Generally, in what we're going to be talking about is magic used in a form of harm. However, there are other kinds of magic. There's white magic and folk magic, stuff you could do with animals, stuff you could do with nature. Kind of, it's like a blanket phrase to be put onto the unexplained or the unexplainable. Some of the harmful magics, though, include potions and curses, inscriptions, shape-shifting, necromancy, and communing with the devil. Witchcraft was particularly likely to be suspected when a disease came on, either unusually swiftly or lingered for a long time, couldn't be diagnosed early, or presented some other unusual symptoms. If something was new or different, it was like, oh, wait a minute. This has to be a witch. It's according to Brian Levac in the Oxford Handbook of Witchcraft. Witches are mentioned in the Bible, which is a big thing. The Witch of Endor appears in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Therefore, a good Puritan is going to read that in the Bible and say, well, obviously witches are real. It's right here. So witchcraft, and it's very conflicting because there are people in the story who practice some of this folk magic and white magic, and they understand that one can fight black magic with white magic, but it's still the use of magic, so it's still bad, but it's not as bad, but you shouldn't do it, but I'm glad you did. It's this really weird back and forth conflicting kind of thing, and it's all made up so it seems so willy-nilly, But when we're talking about witchcraft, in this story, mostly what we're going to be talking about is possession, hurting someone and like haunting someone, pinching them, and pricking them and just causing them to have fits. There have been European witch trials for a very, very long time. As a matter of fact, by the time the Salem witch trials come around, the whole practice of witch trials in Europe was waning. It wasn't in vogue anymore at all. The period of the European witch trials with the most active phases and which saw the largest number of fatalities occurred between 1560 and 1630. So our story is 1690. So again, by the time Salem witch trials happened, it's been about 60 years since the decline of this period in Europe. More than 40,000 deaths between the total of 1560 and 1670. 40,000 deaths. In Catholic Spain and Portugal, the numbers of witch trials were fewer because the Spaniards and Portuguese inquisitions were more focused on the crime of public heresy rather than witchcraft. So they cared more about who's speaking out, who's doing things the wrong way publicly, who's not being truthful, or who's disagreeing with what we're doing. We're going to get them. They didn't really concern themselves as much as witchcraft, whereas inversely, or I guess the counterpart is in England and in Germany, it was all witchcraft. There was an infamous wave of witchcraft trials in Germany in the 1560s, with a mass trial happening in Würzburg, which led to the execution of 900 people, all of whom were burned at the stake, most of whom were alive. And that was where they were hyper focused on all this kind of stuff, all the black magic and communing with the devil and all this stuff. The Pendle witch trials, which are some of the most prominent case in English history, was in 1612. It was in northern England, and it resulted in the hanging of 10 of the 11 people who were tried. So let's think about that. 1612, you're going to have people who were born the following decade in this story, who are going to, you would imagine would grow up hearing the story of the witches in Pendle. You have people who are settling in this new world who know all the stories of the Inquisition. They know all the stories of the violence and brutality that surrounds living in this new world. They know how dangerous and how valuable at the same time someone's word and name can be. And this is all happening all at the same time. All told, from between 1400 to 1775, which is pretty big, almost 400 years, about 100,000 people were prosecuted for witchcraft in Europe, and in British America, between 40,000 to 60,000 were executed, most of which were in Europe. So those are the overall European witch trials. Even in between that and Salem, we have witch trials in the New World. There's a thing called the Connecticut witch trials, sometimes called the Hartford witch trials, took place in between 1647 and 1663. There were 37 cases, 11 of which resulted in executions. The first person to ever be executed in the New World, she was hanged for witchcraft. It was on May 26, 1647. Her name was Elsa Young. If you guys know me from the other stuff, you might know that I know another member of the Young family who's from Connecticut, and I've told him to get a 23andMe to figure that out. Interestingly, though, her hometown in Windsor, Connecticut, had an outbreak of influenza. And shortly thereafter, we had people accusing others of witchcraft. Young was also married to a guy named John Young of Windsor and may have been eligible to inherit his property, which would have made her a more attractive target as well. Something that's interesting about the Puritans and life at this time is people died a lot. It was not uncommon for people to be remarried and remarried again because a partner died or because a partner died. That happened a lot. You couldn't get divorced, but people died quite a bit. So you have, Elsa married this guy, John Young. He's got property. He's doing well. People start accusing people of being witches. And what do you know? The girl who would inherit John's wealth, she gets hanged. Now John's a widower. He needs a wife. That happens quite a bit. There's another lady, Margaret Jones, who in 1648 was the first person to be executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts Bay Colony, so just a bit north, right, of Connecticut. And she was the second in New England after Elsa Young. So we're going to go back to talking about Samuel Parris. He's that third minister. The first two quit because they weren't getting paid. And now we have the one who's sticking around. He was born in London. His family got wealthy because his father, Joseph Parris, was heavily involved in the slave trade. So he had some money. It was because of that. His family also owned a plantation in Barbados. Samuel inherited this plantation, and there was shortly thereafter a hurricane that destroyed and damaged everything. He decided to cut his losses. He sold it, and then he also inherited a slave named Tituba in 1680. Tituba is believed to be from Barbados. We don't know as much as we should about her, but she was essentially property and went to New England with him. She lived with him. She took care of the kids. She took care of the household. And in 1689, when Samuel became the minister to Salem Village, she was with him as well. Interestingly, as the minister of the town, he had the power to jail people. He didn't have the power to have someone executed just by writing it down, but he could jail someone for behaving a certain way or doing something that's particularly that he disagreed with. He was fiercely conservative. He was a real bastard. He would withhold communion and hearing confession for people who weren't practicing things the same way that he thought they should. There's a thing called the halfway covenant. By this time, 1680s, 1690s, church numbers were dwindling. Not many people were joining. And there was an idea put forth to allow people to join the church. Essentially, there's all kinds of rules and stuff, but it would allow people to join the church without going through all the steps that everyone else had to do. He was fervently against this. He thought it was total bullshit. One of the things, by the way, is public confession. You would go in front of your entire church and confess all of your sins. They all had to do that. This new covenant said no one has to do that anymore, and he was pissed. He didn't think that was fair. So because of all this, he wasn't getting paid. The village was withholding his wages, and he was pissed. Part of one of his wages was firewood. That was just part of how he was getting paid. And one night he was so furious, and he was trying to write about what was going on. The ink in his inkwell froze because he didn't have any firewood to keep the room warm. This is in October, November or so. His daughter was a gal named Elizabeth or Betty Paris. We'll get more into her, but this is important. Samuel is going to be a constant in this entire story. He will eventually act as a sort of prosecutor. Just keep in mind the money situation of everything we've already talked about. Just before stuff kicks off in Salem, in 1688, the behaviors of several children in the home of the Goodwin family in Boston result in the accusation, trial, and execution of their Irish washerwoman, a lady named Anne Glover, also known as Goody Glover. And the accusation, trial, and execution were over witchcraft. Glover, this Irish woman, only spoke Gaelic, was probably Catholic. She was interrogated by a guy named Cotton Mather. We're going to talk about Cotton Mather really quick, but one thing that I need to point out is anything different to these people, to the Puritans, was considered heinous. So French, Catholic, Irish, Native, African, if you're not one of them, you had a soul, and that soul was worth saving. But that's it. It's about as far as their progressiveness went. So Cotton Mather and Increase Mather, these are two guys that we're going to talk about. Cotton Mather is a bit more involved in the story. He was born in February 1663 in Boston. He was involved in this Goodwin case. He basically listened to the children, went and saw what they were going to. They were having fits. They were having types of seizures and then getting really quiet and then writhing. They were acting very strangely. So he really believed in this. Cotton really believed that the devil and witches were at war. And why wouldn't you, when everything you've heard your entire life is about witches and the devil and the wars happening all over in the real plane of existence? You have people these are Harvard educated men, Harvard at the time, but still educated men, which is rare enough, who are believing in all this stuff. Harvard at that time was a bastion of hyper conservative education, as opposed to the more liberal Oxford that was kind of the counterpart at the time. Cotton believed that witches who were convicted of the most grievous crimes should be executed, but lesser crimes should be forgiven. He wasn't after blood. He really thought no, we have to stop the devil. It's the devil. Hello. So he's an interesting guy. His father is a guy named Increase Mather, who was born in Dorchester, Massachusetts. He wrote a publication called Remarkable Provinces. In Remarkable Provinces, he's kind of pulling together sources from like Martin Luther and other well-known writers, and sources on spirits, how to handle them. He was also pulling from the Malleus Maleficarum, which I mentioned earlier. He also believed in this, but in a much more doctrine-esque kind of way. He believed in it in a let's consider it in a more metaphysical way, as opposed to a more, no, this is a real fight, this is a real war that's going on, like his son does. So the Goodwin family that happened in Boston, which you have to again imagine was the talk of the town. Okay, that was in 1688. In 1692, January 20th, 11-year-old Abigail Williams and 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris, so 11 and 9, so 4 years prior was the Goodwin family. So that would be 7 and 5 when they're hearing the story about this family with a witch, with children being possessed. These two, one of whom, by the way, Elizabeth Parris is Samuel Parris's daughter. She goes by Betty. They begin acting like the Goodwin children had. So they're writhing around, they're freaking out, they're yelling, they're screaming. Shortly thereafter, Ann Putnam Jr., who was 12, and Elizabeth Hubbard, who was 17, followed suit. They did the same thing. A former minister named Deodat Lawson witnessed it, and he would try to preach to them and like pray, and they would interrupt and scream. Mid-February, a doctor who we believe was a guy named Dr. Griggs treated the girls and immediately suggested that witchcraft was a likely culprit, just right away. Late February, that same February, 1692, Mary Sibley, who was the neighbor of the Parris family, instructed a guy named John Indian. John Indian, we're going to talk about him. Actually, we'll just talk about him now. He's married to Tituba. So he's married to the Parris slave. His name is John Indian. These fucking losers couldn't come up with a better name for a guy, so they named him John Indian. And Mary Sibley, the neighbor, instructs John to make what's called a witch cake out of rice meal and the urine of the girls, and then feed it to a dog in order to discover who might be bewitching the girls. The belief was, and this is white magic, by the way, the belief was that the dog would eat it, whatever magic would happen, and then he would lead them to who was bewitching the girls. This was quickly found out. Parris found out right away. He wasn't down with that, and he was furious. She expressed regret and said, "You're right, I'm sorry, I don't know why I did that." But there's all this like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Everything's bubbling, bubbling, bubbling. Elizabeth Parris identifies Tituba. She blames Tituba, and the girls later accuse a gal named Sarah Osborne and another gal named Sarah Good, all of witchcraft. So we have 3 witches. Let's talk about Tituba. Like I said, she's married to John Indian. She was a Native American slave. We think probably West Indian from Barbados, probably. She was at first enslaved by the Spaniards and eventually sold to Samuel Thompson. Thompson eventually died, and Samuel Parris acquired that estate, Tituba along with it. The belief is that she gained knowledge of witchcraft and practices while in Barbados, which had been heavily colonized and integrated with many kinds of life, right? All walks of life are going through. There was voodoo, there's Christianity, there's mainland Native American beliefs. There's all kinds of stuff happening because everybody's going through all at once. So they believe she probably learned a bunch of stuff then. She was smart. She was very smart. She kind of used their own logic against them sometimes. She claimed, even when it was brought up, that she had the knowledge only to know how to defend herself, which, again, they had to believe, because you had to believe that this stuff was real because it was in the Bible. You know, you remember that train of thought. It's theorized that Tituba, I say Tituba, but it's Tituba, may have told tales of voodoo and witchcraft to the girls of Salem, you know, Wouldn't you tell those little snot scary stories? I would. It's also believed that she may have entertained the girls with fortune telling using egg whites and a mirror. And you would it's like a form of divination. You would crack an egg and like look at the mirror and like see something. And that was, she did do that. And you have to think, when you're a young girl and you start doing a thing, who knows why, and you have to blame it on someone. Again, it's going to be the person who you believe to be of the lowest risk or lowest worth to you. It's tragic. We ride for Tituba. She's tragic, but we'll find out more about her. The other lady who is named Sarah Osborne. She was born in Watertown, Massachusetts, in 1643. She was the mother of 3 in her first marriage. First marriage ended because the guy died. She got some money from that. She hired an Irish indentured servant named Alexander Osborne, who paid off his indenture, and they got married. And this was like kind of unusual. Okay. Her first husband, Robert Prince, intended to leave his 150-acre farm to his 2 sons that Sarah had with him. However, because Sarah married this guy in this society, if a woman had assets, the second she was married, those assets belonged to the husband. So that's what happened. Alexander Osborne was a free man. They got married. It's his 150-acre farm at this point. So this really was, this was radical. This was so unusual. Due to the controversy, Sarah Osborne hadn't attended church in over 3 years. She claimed a kind of sickness, a malady. It was most likely depression. And she was also with legal issues over the Putnam family through her first husband. So she's not a very well-liked person. She didn't follow the standard practice. She married an Irish guy. She married an Irish former indentured servant. And she was looked at as though she took wealth and land from her 2 sons. And this is according to Megan Carroll in her book, Sarah Osborne, on the Salem Witch Trials. When Sarah Osborne is brought into the meeting room, when there's a meeting house in Salem Village that they're deciding to use as a sort of courtroom. And when she's brought in, all 4 girls start writhing around in pain and screaming on the ground. Her immediate defense was, I'm more likely to be bewitched than to be a witch myself. She doesn't have a good, And so again, why would she be blamed? Why would she be named by these girls? She hasn't been to church. She's probably heard people. They probably heard people talking about her because of how unusual her existence is. She is like married to the Irish guy who was a servant. She's got issues with the Putnam family, who are huge, very significant, important family. And Putnam is one of the 4 girls who names her, okay, who goes along with this. So that all tracks to me. And then lastly, we have Sarah Good. Sarah Good is really interesting. She was born by the name of Sarah Solart in Wenham, Massachusetts in 1653. In 1672, when she was 17, her well-to-do tavern owner father killed himself. He had a 70-acre farm, and it was divided between the widow and 2 sons, and then a small portion was to be split by the 7 remaining daughters. But then a similar thing happened where the widowed mother married immediately, and he denied the girls anything. So Sarah was essentially left with nothing. She eventually married another indentured servant who died shortly thereafter, and left his indenturement, whatever it is, his status was left with her. So she was in immense debt. She just got the worst hand dealt to her. She and another new husband sold all of their possessions and claims, and were still impoverished and homeless. They were forced to beg from the households of Salem. They would walk around. They would beg for food. They would beg to please let me sleep in the barn. There was a particular barn in Boston that she got turned away from for being allowed to sleep in, even though they were kind of kin to her. It was rumored that she would walk off muttering, and she did so in front of Samuel Parris. After he gave her a charity but said, you can't sleep here, she walked off and was muttering. And that's kind of seen as like casting a little spell, you know. She developed a reputation for being unpleasant, whether she did receive charity or not. When Samuel and Mary Abbey gave her lodgings for a time, they said that she was so turbulent in spirit, spiteful, and so maliciously bent that they put her out. This is according to Paul Boyer in his book Salem Possessed. Her husband told the examiners once she was named with by the four girls that she was an enemy to all good. Her husband said this. When accused of never attending church, she said it was because she hadn't any proper attire for the services. She was she was just kind of wayward. She didn't really fit in. All three of these women don't really fit into this society. You have a gal who's from a foreign place who is an actual slave. You have a lady who, in the eyes of the population, behaved selfishly and denied her sons of their birthrights or whatever, and who also married an Irishman. And then you have this lady who had a hell of a life dealt to her, who is then a vagrant and also has a daughter who's with her, whose name is Dorothy or Dorcas. Dorcas is the actual name. Something funny that happened when I was looking all this stuff up too. I found pictures and I was like, oh shit, I've never seen a picture of any of these girls. This is amazing. I could put this in the thing. I started saving them and adding them into my little notes here and all this stuff. And then I realized that's AI. Pictures did not exist yet. There's lots of drawings and sketches and stuff from the time, but there are no photographs. So there are lots of people who get named throughout this whole thing. We're really only going to focus on a few of them because there are so many who get accused and who get named. It would take me about 19 parts at like 45 minutes each. I can't do that, and I don't think you want that either. So I'm gonna go through this next section. Has a lot of dates. The reason I'm going to include the dates is because I think it's important to see how quickly everything moves. Okay. February 29th, leap year, 1691. Doesn't make sense, but that's the date. I don't know. I think leap years have to be even, but anyway. Formal complaints were made for the arrest of Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba for the bewitchment of the four girls: Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., and Elizabeth Hubbard. Between March 1st and the 7th, all three women were interrogated by a guy named John Hawthorne and a guy named John Corwin. They're essentially henchmen, particularly Corwin. He's a real bastard. This resulted in Tituba confessing and confirming that Good and Osborne were her co-conspirators. So they scared her and they got her to say, yep, she did it with us. They would lead people a lot in these questions. They wouldn't say, so what were you doing on this night? They would say, when the devil appeared in front of you, did he have a book? They would put the idea there and you would kind of go, yes. Okay. March 11th, that same year, Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, Mary Warren were all alleged to be afflicted by witchcraft. The following day, Ann Putnam accused Martha Corey, the wife of Giles Corey, of witchcraft. A week later, Abigail Williams accuses Rebecca Nurse of witchcraft. 2 days later, Hawthorne and Corwin examine Martha Corey, Giles Corey's wife. 2 days later, on March 23rd, the 4-year-old Dorothy Good, or Dorcas Good, is arrested after Mary Walcott and Ann Putnam Jr. accuse her of biting them like an animal. She's 4. Dorothy confessed to practicing witchcraft and that she witnessed her mother, Sarah Good, of consorting with the devil. She's a little girl. She's 4. She's 4, and they arrest her. She might have the most tragic story out of all of them. 2 days later, Corwin and Hawthorne examined Rebecca Nurse and Dorothy Good, or Dorcas Good, questioning Dorothy for 2 days. 3 days later, on the 28th of March, Elizabeth Proctor is accused of witchcraft. 5 days later, Sarah Cloyce, after defending her sister, Rebecca Nurse, is accused of witchcraft. So she said, my sister wasn't doing anything. Then you must be a witch. During her questioning, Tituba is, again, she's being led. They're talking about the book. They're talking about creatures. They're talking about all this stuff. And Tituba says that there are 4 other witches, including the 3, so 7 total, and a man in a black hat and a black dog who's kind of in charge. But it's the first mention of a man being involved in this. Tituba also mentions a creature in the form of a head with only legs, which was supposed to be Sarah Osborne, to which Abigail Williams screams that she saw the same thing. And now we get into this idea of what's called spectral evidence. Spectral evidence is kind of the crux of this whole story. Basically, it's if somebody says they saw someone doing some witchy shit, then it's evidence. They witnessed it. They saw it. It can be, I saw a figure following me and it was the shape of this person. That's spectral evidence. It can be falling into a fit when someone comes into the room. It can be anything from what are called witches' marks, witches' marks are specifically actually like nipples. They're teats. Could be anything from blemishes to skin tags or moles or whatever, but it was used to allow the minions of the devil to suckle on you. And these were investigated by women, could only look at women, and men would look at men and investigate and check out their bodies. That's also a form of spectral evidence, but a little more realistic. They would do this thing called the touch test too, where it was so silly. If I'm accused of being the witch and my accuser is right here, they would have me touch the accuser, and the accuser would then and writhe in pain, and would be like, well, obviously this is a witch. There's no way around it. Later on, they would do that blindfolded, and they would get different results. Other indications that were taken into, they weren't necessarily witches' marks, but they were taken as peculiar, were indicators like strength, abilities like shooting well or tying knots and stuff, good hearing, all potential gifts of the devil. Like, why are you so good? How did you hear that? Why did so many people see you doing things that day? How do you have so much energy? These are all things that are bargained with the devil, you know. They also, when they went to Sarah Osborne's home, Hawthorne and Corwin were looking for poppets. Poppets are essentially voodoo dolls, but they're made with just like singular pieces, very Blair Witch, like the sticks that the witch would leave for the campers. Very much look like that. Coincidentally, at the same time, after these arrests and stuff starts really happening, Sarah Good was arrested, right? And she was placed in a barn in Salem town. And this is the same barn that she was denied from by her kin, which is an irony. Prior to this, it came up in this conversation that she had threatened a man named Herrick, and because he turned her away, she said that his best cow would be lost and like the devil take it kind of a thing. And the cow actually did die later on. So that was her initial accusation happened, and then someone came forward with that story, and then it was like, put her in a fucking jail, dude. She is scary. She escaped one night very early at this time in I think it's still March, and the only thing that was left in the barn were her shoes. So she was walking barefoot for miles in the March weather in New England with her child, with Dorothy. And the same night, Samuel Sibley, husband of the gal who made the urine cake, saw a vision, saw something, and one of the four girls was in the house too, and said, "She's there. It's a beast on the table." And he swung in the air with his walking stick, and the girl said, "You hit it. You've struck it. You struck it on the back. You struck it on the side." And they identified it as Sarah Good because they were the form was shoeless. And the next day, Sarah was actually found nearby with a bloodied arm, which is odd. I don't know if that really happened, but that's part of the story. Okay. John Indian, we're in the April of 1691, the husband of Tituba. He claimed that Sarah Proctor was bewitching him. John Proctor threatened John Indian and was brought to the front of the meeting room, where Abigail Williams claimed that John Proctor was attacking a girl named Bieber, who then fell to the floor. So there were more than just these four girls, but the four girls were kind of the core who were making all this stuff happen. So then John Proctor gets arrested. On April 11th that same year, Sarah Cloyce and Elizabeth Proctor, wife of John, are examined before Deputy Governor Thomas Danforth and members of the Governor's Council. On the same day, Elizabeth's husband, John, becomes the first man accused of witchcraft and is officially jailed. So his wife gets accused by John Indian. John Proctor gets up and says, "What the fuck are you talking about?" and freaks out. And one of the girls, Abigail Williams, really quickly goes, he's one. And another girl follows suit and falls to the floor. And they say, yep, clearly he is indeed a witch. Later on in that April, the Proctor's servant and accuser, Mary Warren, admits to lying. So one of the girls admits she was lying and accuses the other girls of lying. Okay, so in April 1691, no one's died yet. One of the group of girls who was originally pretending to be afflicted says, I made this all up, and all the other girls have made it up too. April 13th, Ann Putnam Jr. accuses Giles Corey of witchcraft, claiming that a man who died at his house haunts her by Giles' request. So a guy died at Giles' house, and then Giles can control the spirit and is making the spirit haunt Ann Putnam Jr. Around this time, Abigail Hobbs, Bridget Bishop, Giles Corey, and Mary Warren are examined. Deliverance Hobbs confesses to practicing witchcraft. Mary Warren, under pressure and accused now of witchcraft herself, reverses her statement made in early April and goes back to saying, it's all true. It's all true. It's all this witchcraft stuff is true. Something that's really interesting about all of this, if you confess to witchcraft, you were not murdered. You weren't hung. The only people who died during all of this, minus one, claimed to be not guilty. Giles Corey never claimed either way. If you confessed to being a witch, you lost a lot. Your name had an asterisk next to it, but you could be forgiven and rejoin the church and restart your life, but you and lose all your property and stuff like that. It was socially and spiritually bankrupting yourself, but you could rebuild. You would not die. If you refused guilt and then were found guilty, then you would be killed. If somebody's in a place where they think, you know what, I can't get out of this, I'm a witch, I'm guilty. Not a reasonable route, I think we could all agree. April 22nd, Mary Easty, who defended her sister Rebecca Nurse, is examined by Hawthorne and Corwin, the two henchmen we were talking about. Hawthorne and Corwin also examine Nehemiah Abbott Jr., Sarah Wilds, William and Deliverance Hobbs, Edward and Sarah Bishop, Mary Black, and Mary English. April 30th, several girls accuse former Salem minister George Burroughs of witchcraft. If you remember, there were three ministers of the area. One had the last name Bailey. The second one is George Burroughs, this guy. This is a former minister being accused of witchcraft by several girls in late April. May 2nd, Hawthorne and Corwin examine Sarah Morey, Lydia Dustin, Susanna Martin, and Dorcas Hoare. May 4th, George Burroughs, that second minister, is arrested in Maine, and he's sent back to Salem 3 days later and subsequently jailed. So imagine thinking, these fuckers didn't pay me. I'm getting out of here. I'm going to Maine. Boom, you get arrested for witchcraft. Corwin and Hawthorne examine George Burroughs and Sarah Churchill. Burroughs is moved to a Boston jail. And May 10th, Corwin and Hawthorne examine George Jacobs Sr. and his granddaughter, Margaret Jacobs. Sarah Osborne dies in prison. She's our first casualty. May 10th, 1691, she dies in prison. So she's not hanged. She's not found guilty. She's being held, and these jails are so despicable that she dies. May 14th, at this time, we're starting to get some attention. Someone died. It's spreading like wildfire. We're going to start getting some bigger names involved in this now. The Reverend Increase Mather and Sir William Phipps, the newly appointed governor of the colony, arrive in Boston. They bring with them a new charter establishing the province of Massachusetts Bay. This charter and the rules therein that are changed, they had new rules which required prospective voters to own 40 pounds worth of property or real estate that yielded at least 2 pounds per year in rent. So Benjamin Laborie estimates that this included about 3/4 of the adult male population at the time. The charter also guaranteed freedom of worship, but only for non-Catholic Christians. So basically what this means is You can only vote if you own land. Remember what we were talking about? How if someone inherited money or land or whatever kind of wealth, and then they were seen as a target or a very eligible bachelor, depending on which way you looked at it, right? This is it in writing of what's happening. The population of the entire settlement prior to 1700, by the way, is a little bit less than 55,000 people, just to put it into a perspective. Let's talk about Sir William Phips. Phips is an interesting guy to me. He's definitely all about the Benjamins. He's all about money and status. He's a little secular. It's interesting. He's the first royally appointed governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay and the first native-born person from New England to be knighted, which is just a cool fact in itself. He was knighted because he was a treasure hunter. He was a legitimate, he would go out looking for shipwrecks and treasures left over by the Spanish and other stuff. And he was knighted after finding 40,000 pounds of silver. And so he got knighted, and he's immediately moved up, okay? He was boys with Increase Mather, and Increase had some influence over Sir William to be the royal governor of Massachusetts Bay. He was very different towards the theocracy kind of aspect of all of this, but it didn't matter because the buck stopped with him. He was the head honcho of the colony at the time. For the majority of all this hysteria, he's in Maine. He's doing other stuff. At this time, there are active native attacks happening, particularly in Maine, constantly. People are getting killed constantly. So he helped build a fort up there. He did all this stuff. He's involved in lots of stuff. He kind of had a whole, I don't know, Pontius Pilate thing where he's, you get the feeling that he knew something wrong was going on, but he kind of washed his hands of it and said, oh, well. He, unfortunately, really liked this guy named William Stoughton. Stoughton we're going to talk more about later on, but Stoughton becomes kind of the main prosecutor, the main magistrate is what they're called. By May 18th, Mary Eastie is released from prison. Following protests by her accusers, she is then rearrested. A guy named Roger Toothaker is also arrested on charges of witchcraft. Governor Phips issues a commission for something called a Court of Oyer and Terminer and appoints as judges John Hawthorne, Nathaniel Saltonstall, Bartholomew Gedney, Peter Sargent, Samuel Sewell, Waitstill Winthrop, and the Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton. Hawthorne, Corwin, and Gedney examine Martha Carrier, John Eldon, Wilmot Red, Elizabeth Howe, and Philip English shortly thereafter on May 31st. So now we got to talk about Oyer and Terminer. Oyer and Terminer was created in this instance in May 27th, 1692. It's a French term to hear and to determine. It's kind of a pop-up court that has all authority. Like it's its own entity. It functions as its own judge, jury, execution, all in one. It's kind of an emergency commission of judges to make diligent inquiry into all treasons, felonies, and misdemeanors that had been potentially committed wherever they were based. Hawthorne and Corwin, the first two henchmen, they're on this commission of 7. William Stoughton is the newly appointed lieutenant governor and the chief magistrate. So he's Phips' right-hand man and the head guy on this commission of the Oyer and Terminer. At this time, witchcraft was a capital offense and could only end in death if someone was convicted of witchcraft. William Stoughton. He was born in England in 1631. He's a real fuck. If anyone in all of this story is like a bad guy, he's a really bad guy. He would do stuff like forcing people to go back and deliberate if people decided because there was juries, right? And if the jury decided, no, she's not a witch, he would send them back. This happened with Rebecca Nurse, and then they came back and convicted her and fucking hung her. He was a huge proponent of the use of spectral evidence. He believed it. He thought it was just as good as gold, and anyone's word was valid if they were a good Christian. And this is according to Dunn in their book. Around this time, we get the first real trial, and it was with Tituba. She was used as a kind of encyclopedia. She was led by questioning stuff like I said earlier, where it's like, did you see when you saw the black hairy beast, was it standing or sitting? And was there a book placed in front of you? Did you sign the book? You know, she was led, and she's kind of realizing what's going on. Something that is really interesting is with almost all of these people, they only start to blame people who had already been blamed or who were eventually hanged. No one's naming new names who are being accused themselves. Tituba is smart. She starts realizing what's going on, and she starts realizing that she's making them happy because she's telling them what they want to hear. She's looking out for number one. She's looking out for Big Tuba. You know what I mean? At the time, and this is interesting, writing about the trials and the ongoings that was happening in Salem town and Salem village was banned by Phipps. He didn't want it getting out. He didn't want it getting to other places, to Boston, to Maine. Especially didn't want it getting back to England, that this kind of chaos was starting. And the Puritans put a certain amount of weight and value into being able to read, because the Bible is so important, right? So this idea of the book and it being used as a weapon and being used in this trial is like, oh, the devil had you sign his book. It's all designed to keep it contained, because books are scary. Reading is bad. You should only be reading the Bible. Why are you reading about these trials at this place? Kind of thing. So as I said, Stoughton is huge on spectral evidence. He believed in it. He was all about it. Of the 156 people who were eventually taken into custody and brought before the court, 79 of them were charged on the basis of spectral evidence alone, with Stoughton at the helm. The main guy being like, yep, see, it's another one. Another guy who's on this, who's kind of, listen, he's one of the judges. He's one of, this emergency committee that's sending people to their deaths. His name is Samuel Sewell. He's born in Hampshire, England, in 1652. He lived in Newbury, Massachusetts. He attended Harvard. He was the second librarian of Harvard ever. He's one of the 9 judges appointed to the court of Oyer and Terminer, and he was extremely liberal for the time. As a matter of fact, in 1700, he wrote and published a book called The Selling of Joseph, which made a biblically based case that slavery in America was unjust and ungodly and wrong. He was the first anti-slavery document ever published in North America. So he's like radical, and he's on this group of judges hearing all this, but he's like kind of a smart guy, and he's not, he is an interesting one because he has to participate, but you really get the feeling that he didn't want to, that he was not down with this. Formal prosecutions begin June 2nd. On June 2nd, Bridget Bishop is the first to be formally indicted, tried, and convicted of witchcraft. She's sentenced to death. On June 10th, 8 days later, she's hanged at Gallows Hill. She's blindfolded. Her long skirt coattails are tied to her legs to keep her decent when she falls and to make sure that if she kicks, nothing will happen. And she's has a noose put around her neck. She's on a platform and she's shoved off. She's the first one. And it's the next 10 or 15 minutes of this are pretty brutal. June 16th, Roger Toothaker dies in prison. He's the second person who just dies while in custody. June 28th, Sarah Good, one of the first 3, the gal who was essentially homeless, is tried and found guilty. June 29th, Susanna Martin and Rebecca Nurse are tried and found guilty. June 30th, Elizabeth Howe is tried and found guilty. July 2nd, Sarah Wilds is tried and found guilty. That is our 6th person found guilty at that point, if you're counting along with me. July 19th, Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds are executed by hanging at Gallows Hill in Salem. Just like with Bridget Bishop, they're all put on a platform. They're all blindfolded. They all have their coattails tied to their legs, have a noose put over their leg, and they're pushed off one by one. Imagine being the fifth and hearing everybody fall one by one. You're in darkness. Honestly, it's July. It's swelteringly hot. It's probably horrifying. And everyone is watching this too. Everyone in the town is watching this. There are people who are at. John Hale is a character who's going to come up a little bit later. He's at everything that has to do with any of this. Stoughton is at every one of these things. All the magistrates have to watch this. People's family members, their children, their kin, their business partners, whatever. Everyone is watching this. These are all public executions. And one by one, they're shoved off and their necks are snapped. Ugh. Before she's pushed, Sarah Good warns Minister Noyce, who's in attendance, that she was no more a witch than he is a wizard, and if she were to die by hanging, his mouth would fill with blood, and he would have to drink it. She's kind of quoting the Bible a little bit at that point. He died December 13th, 1717, so quite a bit later, years later, of throat and mouth lesions. He bled out of his mouth to death. At this time, shortly thereafter, it was actually in May, but it's coming back to light after this initial run of executions. Martha Carrier was accused by Susanna Sheldon, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard, and Ann Putnam Jr. of being promised by the devil that she would be the queen of hell and that she led an army of 300 witches. And when Martha entered the room on the next hearing day or meeting at the meeting house, all 4 girls fell to the floor and writhed when Martha entered the room. Martha said, "It is false and a shame for you to mind what these say. They are out of their wits." This was written in the court documents that she said this on the 19th of August, 1692 is when this happened. So again, we have someone else. She walks in, 4 girls fall to they're freaking out, and she's known as the Queen of Hell, which is kind of dope. Now, what actually happened? What happened was John Proctor, who was in jail, he wrote a letter to Governor Phipps saying that he witnessed Martha's children being tortured while questioned until they confessed of their mother's guilt. So these girls accused her. She gets jailed. Her children are brought to the jail. John Proctor sees her children being tortured. Forms of torture at this time were pretty common and almost expected. Certain things like ear cropping, nose cutting, whipping, and beating were like standard. It was normal to lose a piece of your ear while being interrogated. It was normal to have your nose, nostrils cut open and to just have a scar. Something called the scold's bridle was an iron muzzle placed on women deemed too loud or unruly by society. It could be left on for months, only open to allow eating or drinking. Pressing or peine forte et dure, French, I don't know, hard or forceful punishment in French, was a form of torture where heavy stones were placed on the accused until they either confessed or died. A thing called neck and knees torture was common, as it left no mark, and it was very effective. I'm going to try to describe this as best I can. I do have a picture that I kind of made that you'll be able to see if you're watching. Imagine doing the sit and reach test like when you were in school, right? You're sitting on your butt with your feet straight out and your arms, and you're trying to touch your toes, right? Imagine a board being laid underneath the back of your knees, and then another board going behind the back of your neck. And then over the 2 ends of the boards on either side of you, ropes are tightened, forcing your head down in between your legs. That's called neck and knees. This is what was happening to Martha Carrier's children while they were being asked, "Is your mother a witch? Did she actually commune with the devil?" And they said, "Yeah." So the 2 young men that this happened to were Richard and Andrew Carrier, and they confessed to seeing a witch's coven and the man in a black hat conversing with their mother, Martha. This also could end in death. This particular torture, you would hemorrhage from internal bleeding because you're essentially bent in half and squished, right? So that's great. And this is what Proctor wrote to the governor that he witnessed. August 3rd is when Martha is officially tried and found guilty. August 4th, George Jacob Sr. and John Willard are tried and found guilty. August 5th, George Burroughs, that second minister, Elizabeth Proctor, and John Proctor are all tried and found guilty. That's 11 found guilty thus far. August 19th, Martha Carrier, George Jacob Sr., John Willard, George Burroughs, and John Proctor are all hanged on Gallows Hill. Elizabeth Proctor is temporarily spared execution because she's pregnant. There's the hypocrisy. They'll save the baby, kill the mother. That leads to 12 hanged thus far. We're going to talk about George Burroughs, that second minister, a little bit. He was never ordained while being the minister at Salem. He was educated at Harvard and considered kind of an odd guy. He had infamously impressive physical strength and hearing, and was eventually accused during his trials of being in multiple places at the same time. He knew his rights, though. He was really smart. He was a minister. He knew his rights and the rules of the court better than anyone else due to his education. And he discussed one-on-one with each juror, which was his right, and insisted on a few being replaced, which was also his right, based on whatever answers he got not being satisfactory to him. His cunning, however, appeared crafty and devilish and worked against him in the court's eyes. The magistrates, the 9 judges, were so angry with him trying to use the system instead of godliness that they mounted such a crazy case and line of questioning against him that even increased Mathers later admitted he couldn't have had him acquitted. Like they really came after this guy, all guns a-blazing. He was executed with John Proctor, Martha Carrier, George Jacobs Sr., and John Willard, but not before reciting the entirety of the Lord's Prayer, which was supposed to be impossible for a witch to do. The crowd, while witnessing him recite the Lord's Prayer, they almost rushed the gallows because they realized, like, wait, he shouldn't be able to do this. He can't be a witch. This is an injustice. This is wrong. He was still hung. He died just like the others. Cotton Mather, who was on a horse, addressed the crowd who were starting to rush and starting to be unruly. He said that he declared that Mr. Burroughs was no ordained minister, partially to possess the people of his guilt, saying that the devil often had been transformed into the angel of light, and this did somewhat appease the people, and the executions went on. When Mr. Burroughs was eventually cut down, he was dragged by a halter to a hole or a grave between rocks about 2 feet deep. His shirt and breeches were pulled off, and an old pair of trousers of one of the executed were put on his lower parts. He was in that way put in together with Willard and Carrier, that one of his hands and his chin and a foot of one of them was left uncovered. They were purposefully buried in very shallow graves. So Cotton Mather basically told everybody, listen, he wasn't ordained. He wasn't a real minister. That's exactly what the devil would do. The devil will often pretend to be an angel of light. Don't be fooled by this. And everybody went, oh, okay. Which is insane. Dorcas Hoare is tried and found guilty. Alice Parker and Ann Pudiator are tried and found guilty. Martha Corey is tried and found guilty. Mary Bradbury and Mary Easty are tried and found guilty. This is from September 6th to September 9th. On the 14th, Samuel Wardwell and Wilmot Red are tried and found guilty. 16th, Mary Parker and Margaret Scott are tried and found guilty. That's 21 found guilty by this time. This is an interesting turn. In September 17th, Abigail Faulkner Sr. is tried and found guilty. Margaret Scott, Wilmot Red, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, and Abigail Faulkner are sentenced to hang. Abigail Faulkner is given a temporary stay of execution because she's pregnant. Rebecca Earns, Mary Lacey, Ann Foster, and Abigail Hobbs plead to guilty to the charges and await sentences. So they, at this point, people are going, holy shit, we got 11 people hung. Actually, 10 people hung because 2 died in custody. Maybe I should admit and just confess, and I won't die. So then we have 24 at that point, people who are either found or confessed to being guilty. Ann Foster was a 73-year-old woman who confessed to being a witch, leaning into what we would today kind of know as being a witch. She was like an old, kind of decrepit woman. She wore a lot of black. She had a bit of a crook nose. She said she used curses and potions and poppets, and she said that she was flying on sticks through the night, and at least at one time with the now dead Martha Carrier, the Queen of Hell lady, who was just hung. And Foster really leaned into it. On September 19th, Giles Corey is pressed to death for refusing to agree to be tried before God and the country. So let's talk about Giles Corey. He is an interesting cat. He was born August 16th, 1611 in Northampton, England. He was a farmer and married to Martha Corey. He gets treated like a warrior, like some bastion of strength. He was kind of a shithead. He was charged prior to all this with many counts of petty theft, and he was brought to trial for the murder of beating to death his indentured farm worker, Jacob Goodale, who they believe was mentally handicapped and was slow to understand direction, and Giles couldn't handle that and beat his ass with a stick after he did something wrong. Giles beat him, and he waited for about 9 days before he sent the boy to Boston to have a doctor look at him, but it was too late and he died. So the capital punishment against indentured servants was allowed. He was allowed to do that. He was found guilty and fined, but he wasn't charged with murder or anything, even though he fucking beat that kid to death. Because he refused to put in a plea of guilty or not guilty, English law prevented a trial from continuing with him. So something that was allowed was exactly what we talked about earlier: pene forte et dure, hard and forcible punishment. The reason is if you confessed, if you made a plea, you could your property was forfeited. He knew, if I don't do this, my property goes on to my sons. They're going to be set. So I'm not going to say shit. I'm not going to say guilty or not guilty. I'm not going to trial. And no matter what, the law will prevent this from happening. So September 17th, 1692, the then sheriff, George Corwin, one of those first 2 henchmen, takes him out into a field, puts him on a board, puts another board on top of him, and then starts stacking weight on top of him. After 2 days, he was asked for pleas this entire time. At one point, his eyes began to bulge, his tongue was hanging out of his mouth, and Corwin put it back in his mouth using the end of his cane. The only thing, supposedly, that he said by the end of these 2 days was more weight. They added more weight, and he was crushed to death. They believe he was asphyxiated. He stopped breathing. He died on the 19th of September, 1692. His wife, Martha, was hanged 3 days later on the 22nd. All estate and possessions went to his 2 sons-in-law, their sons, essentially. However, Corwin, that same shithead, took everything from the estate. He did like a quick sale of livestock, quick sale of pots and pans and barrels, all these things. And according to a guy named Caliph, who we're going to learn about a little bit later, he left the Corey children to the wilderness. This guy, Corwin, fucked over this family. Supposedly, Giles Corey haunts the area of Salem where he was crushed to this day. September 21st, several ministers successfully petitioned the court to postpone Dorcas Hoare's execution to give her time to repent. the 22nd, Martha Corey, Mary Eastie, Alice Parker, Ann Pudiator, Margaret Scott, Wilmot Red, Samuel Wardwell, and Mary Parker are all hanged. It's 21. We're up to 21 people. They're all hanged. It's actually 19 people because people had died in different ways. Actually, it's 18 people. One crushed. Sarah Osborne died, and Toothaker died. There we go. At this point, Mary Bradbury escaped and is not hanged. Let's talk about escapes really quick. Escapes happened, and it's really interesting. Mary Bradbury escaped with the help of her family, according to historian Mary Beth Norton, who wrote a really good book about this. All the prisoners for all this stuff were scattered all throughout Salem Village to Salem Town to Boston because they didn't have one single jail that could hold a couple hundred people. She believes that the jailer in Boston had his hand out and was releasing prisoners for bribes. Mary Bradbury, by the way, is Mary Beth Norton's ancestor, which is interesting. George Jacobs Jr. escaped and remained unknown. They don't know where he went. He vanished. Philip English, or who was originally Philippe d'Anglais, was a French Protestant who originally was wealthy and he escaped as well. Used his wealth. I think they had to pay around £4,000 is what the belief is to get him and his wife out. And the crazy thing is an average salary is about £60 a year. They paid £4,000 to get away. A guy named Captain John Eldon escaped after 15 weeks in a Boston jail near the end of August. An arrest warrant was written for him after his arrest. So when he got taken in, there wasn't a warrant. It got written after he was arrested. So he knew from the beginning that his trial was a farce, and he probably knew that once the hysteria died down, he would be fine. Samuel Willard, a friend of Captain John Eldon, he was the minister of the Boston Third Church, may have influenced a lot of these escapes because he preached a certain Bible verse that said, "But when they persecute you in this city, flee into the next." The escapes were encouraged after Burroughs. After that minister died is when ministers around the area started preaching and potentially influencing people. And this was shortly thereafter where people got inspired and scared. I think scared is a reasonable way to put it. So yeah, people were escaping, which is really, really interesting. Increase Mather, the then president of Harvard College and father of Cotton Mather, officially denounces the use of spectral evidence. So we're about halfway through. We've got 21 people total died. Increase, the one who's a little more metaphysical and a little more, I think, logical, says, hey, spectral evidence is bullshit, man. You can't use this. October 6th, 8 children in custody are released on a $2,500 bail. October 12th, Governor Phipps writes to the Privy Council of King William and Queen Mary saying that he has stopped the proceedings and referring to what dangers some of their innocent subjects might be exposed to if the evidence of the afflicted persons only did prevail, i.e. spectral evidence. So things are coming to a fever pitch. Increase Mather denounces spectral evidence on the 3rd, and then on October 12th, the governor writes to the king and queen back home saying, I'm putting an end to this. This is crazy. By October 29th, Phipps prohibits further arrests and releases many of the accused from prison and dissolves the court of Oyer and Terminer. Now, why did he really do that? Well, A, things are getting out of hand. B, he doesn't want to get in trouble. He doesn't want to lose money. He cares about money. And then C, accusations by Elizabeth Hubbard, Sarah Bieber, Mary Walcott, Mary Warren, and Ann Putnam Jr. accused Lady Mary Phipps, the governor's wife, the governess, of being a witch and tormenting them with spectral attacks. Specifically, they claimed her spectral form was involved in the mysterious illness of a 29-year-old man named Timothy Swan. this gets to a point where I think the elite and the higher ups kind of go, "What? You who?" And I think this was kind of the turning point in an official way. Lady Phipps was never formally tried. The accusations against her highlight the breadth and intensity of the witch hunt, but nothing official was ever done. The governor dissolved the Oyer and Terminer before anything like that could ever happen. And the tide starts to turn. John Hale, who was a minister and very much in support of the trials as they began, he was at every meeting and every hearing, like I said earlier. He was born in Beverly, Massachusetts in 1636. And John Hale is relevant to this because of the following. The accusers, in aiming at such characters like Lady Phipps and others, greatly overestimated their power, and the tide began to turn against them. But what finally broke the spell by which they had held the minds of the whole colony in bondage was their accusation in October of Mrs. Hale, the wife of the minister of the First Church in Beverly, John Hale. Her genuine and distinguished virtues had won for her a reputation and secured in the hearts of the people of confidence which superstition itself could not sully nor shake. Mr. Hale had been active in all the previous meetings, but he knew the innocence and piety of his wife, and he stood forth between her and the storm he had helped to raise. Although he had driven it on while others were the victims, he turned and resisted it when it burst in upon his own dwelling. So this guy, imagine, John Hale is he's behind all these things. He believes in this. He believes in spectral evidence. He believes they're doing the right thing. And then his wife is accused at some point, and he does a complete 180, and he realizes, holy shit, they've been lying. They've been lying this whole time. December 16th, an act is passed by Phipps, which establishes a new superior court, and it's to convene in January to hear and prosecute the remaining people who are in custody. Now we move into 1693. Now this is where things really start to turn. Sarah Buckley, Margaret Jacobs, Rebecca Jacobs, Mary Whitteredge are tried and found not guilty January 4th. Those are the first not guilty findings. January 5th, Job Tukey and Hannah Tyler are found not guilty. January 6th, Mary Marston, Elizabeth Johnson Sr., and Abigail Barker are tried and found not guilty. January 7th, Mary Tyler, tried and found not guilty. The 9th, Rebecca Johnson, is cleared by proclamation. So she didn't even get tried. She just got cleared. January 10th, Sarah Wardwell is tried and found guilty. Her two daughters, Sarah Hawkes and Mercy Wardwell, are tried and found not guilty. So one more person is found guilty. January 11th, Elizabeth Johnson Jr. is tried and found not guilty. Mary Black is cleared by proclamation the same day. January 12th, Mary Post is tried and found guilty. Mary Bridges Sr., Hannah Post, Sarah Bridges, and Mary Osgood are tried and found not guilty. Thomas Farrar Sr. is cleared by proclamation. Tide is turning. Tide is turning. January 13th, Mary Lacey Sr. is tried and found not guilty. February 1st, so almost a year later, Sarah Cole, Lydia Dustin, Sarah Dustin, Mary Taylor, and Mary Toothaker are tried and found not guilty. Lydia Dustin, however, is not released because she's unable to pay her jailer's fees. So jail worked differently at the time. When you were in jail, you might be fed every couple of days, but it was up to your family to bring you food, to bring you fresh straw, to bring you maybe something to sit on. And then you had to pay for your time there in order to leave. This poor woman, Lydia Dustin, was unable to leave because she could not pay for her jail fees. February 3rd, Jane Lilly is cleared by proclamation. On the 21st of February, Governor Phipps writes to England that 53 people had already been cleared, failing to be indicted by grand juries or found not guilty at a trial, and that he has vacated the death sentences of those who have been sentenced to be executed. So Phipps he pulled the lever, full stop, emergency brake is on. March 10th, Lydia Dustin, the woman who couldn't pay her fucking jail fees, dies while in custody. She was sick and she died. April 25th, John Eldon, the captain who escaped, he's cleared by proclamation. May 10th, Susanna Post, Eunice Fryer, Mary Bridges Jr., Mary Barker, and William Barker are tried and found not guilty. Sarah Cole, Dorothy Faulkner, Abigail Faulkner, Martha Tyler, Joanna Tyler, Sarah Wilson, and Sarah Wilson Sr. and Sarah Wilson Jr. are all cleared by proclamation. A grand jury fails to indict Tituba. May 11th, William Hobbs is cleared by proclamation. And at that point, everyone is out and cleared. Once this secondary Supreme Court is commenced and all of these things are happening, all spectral evidence is indicated with ignoramus, meaning we don't know. So it's recorded, but it's not considered evidence anymore. Over 200 people were accused, 66 accusers in all. 25 were found guilty, 26 were found not guilty, and the others were cleared by proclamation. 19 were hanged, 1 was crushed, and 2 died in jail. Actually, 3 died in jail. I was 1 off there because we have Toothaker, Osborne, and then Dustin, the lady who just died. So again, 19 hanged, 1 crushed, 3 died in jail. The aftermath. Okay, so that's the whole of the trials. Thomas Moll, a notable Quaker, who, again, are enemies to these Puritans, wrote a chapter in a book called Truth Held Forth and Maintained, stating, "It were better that 100 witches should live than that one person be put to death for a witch which is not a witch," digging at Increase Mather. The reason he said this is because Increase Mather said it would be better that 10 witches would go free than one person be put to death. Thomas Moll is criticizing the Mathers. He's criticizing Increase, saying, hey, it would be better if 100 people who were actually witches went free than one innocent get killed. Basically, there's a lot of criticism based around this. January 14th, 1697, a day of fast was held. Samuel Sewall asked to read aloud his apology to the congregation. So this is what I said. He had an interesting turn at the end. He felt true remorse by the end of this. He wanted to take the blame and shame of the late commission of Oyer and Terminer at Salem. He said that. He said, I was part of this. It shouldn't have happened. I apologize. In 1693 through 1697, a guy named Robert Califf collected stories and correspondences and court records and other accounts of the trials and placed them for his book Opposing Cotton Mathers, titled More Wonders of the Invisible World. Cotton had a book called Wonders of the Invisible World. Califf, just a grade A troll, put out More Wonders of the Invisible World. Califf couldn't even get it published in Boston, so it was done in London in the year 1700 because the Mathers, Samuel Parris, Burroughs, they're all so well regarded in society, as well as the governor, Phipps. Can't get that thing published. But Califf is a true critic and is really, really putting the screws to all the men who were responsible for this. In May 1709, 22 people who had been convicted of witchcraft or whose relatives had been convicted of witchcraft presented the government with a petition in which they demanded that both a reversal of attainder and compensation of financial losses. In 1703, Martha Corey's excommunication was reversed. 1706, Ann Putnam Jr. asked Salem Village Church for forgiveness. She blamed her acts not of ones of malice, but that the devil had deluded her, and she was accepted back into the church. So Ann Putnam Jr. was kind of the most vocal. She was involved in the most of the accusations. Her family owned something like 30% of all the land in Salem at the time. They were very respected. They were very powerful. She said, listen, the devil made me do it. I'm really sorry, but it was the devil, and they accepted her back. In 1711, 570 pounds was to be divided among the survivors of the 22 people affected by the trials. And in 1712, Rebecca Nurse and Giles Corey excommunications were also reversed. We are now in the finale We're going to start saying goodbye to cast members. We're 2 hours in. That's perfect. Anne Putnam. Both of Anne's parents died in 1699, so a few years after the trials, and she was left to raise 9 children and never married. She was chronically ill after the trials for the rest of her life. She died in 1716 at the age of 36. Part of her confession goes as follows. I desire to be humbled before God for that sad and humbling providence that befell my father's family in the year about 92. That would be 1692. That I, then being in my childhood, should, by a providence of God, be made an instrument for the accusing of several people for grievous crimes. This is all a run-on sentence, by the way, whereby their lives was taken away from them, whom now I have just grounds and good reason to believe they were innocent persons. And that it was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time. So that's part of her confession, where she admits that the devil made her do it. But hey, it's not her. What about Elizabeth Parris, Betty Parris? In 1693, the Salem witch trials ended, and Betty Parris never retracted her accusations or made any acknowledgments. She no-sold it. She just said, nah, is what it is. 1710, at the age of 27, she married Benjamin Barron, a yeoman, trader, cord, wainer, and shoemaker. Her father still cared for her and her siblings. Parris provided her with household stuff to better furnish her home with Benjamin. He bought her silver and money and plates. It was his baby girl. She and Barron had 4 children, and Betty survived her husband by 6 years, dying March 21st, 1760, in Concord, Massachusetts, at the age of 77. Abigail Williams completely disappeared. There are no records after 1696. Her fate is totally unknown. Elizabeth Hubbard, the fourth girl. It's unclear what happened to Hubbard after the trials concluded. American historian Mary Beth Norton, the lady who we talked about earlier, states in her book In the Devil's Snare that Hubbard moved from Salem to Gloucester in Massachusetts. Norton purports that Hubbard married a man named John Bennett, with whom she had 4 children. Tituba. What happened to Tituba after all this? She was in jail for a year and never indicted. So she suffered. There's people dropping like flies. She sat there the whole time. Parris, Samuel Parris, that fuck, refused to pay for her jail fee and was even kind of obligated to do so as her property owner. Since she was a slave, she was seen as property. He was the owner. It's, Tituba was confiscated essentially by the state, and it's believed that she went on to work for the state, but no record of where she went exists. Cotton Mather. Cotton was an avid writer and equating Satan's forces in this instance to the French cavalry, to legions, he kind of fantasized the trials. His father, Increase, as we said earlier, eventually disagreed with him. And his book, Increase's book, was read aloud at Harvard in front of Cotton, signed by all the ministers there at Harvard, minus Cotton, which basically said, spectral evidence is bullshit. This was all wrong. Increase also said that it was hypocritical to use supernatural tests for supernatural crimes. How could one be okay to determine something that isn't okay? Which Cotton was very much in favor of. Cotton would kind of always have his name with the stain of Salem under it. He would eventually write Wonder of the Invisible World to defend their system and Stoughton's name. But he maintained until he died that legitimate witches had been executed. He bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. He believed that there were witches they killed that were totally justifiable. As I said, Robert Califf published more Wonders of the Invisible World in 1700, attacking Cotton over his role in the events. Cotton died on his 65th birthday and buried in Copp's Hill in the north end of Boston. Samuel Parris was blamed by the survivors as the initial instigator and tormentor of their woes. Parris blamed God. He didn't blame God so much as he said, This was a test that the Lord put in front of us, kind of a thing. After this was all done, the rates committee in the area did not collect his area. He never got paid. That's hilarious. He never got fucking paid. He's a real scumbag. He apologized for his behavior during the trials in an essay, Meditation for Peace. Increased Mather then led a church council, which kind of vindicated him. So again, it's this interesting thing where it's like, if you admit that you did wrong, you can be forgiven. And that's exactly, Increase was like, okay, good. Yeah, you're justified. Like, you're okay now. He publicly apologized during Sunday Mass for his involvement in the trials in November 1694. He mostly blamed God's will, but he did publicly say, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have been involved. He died February 27, 1720 in Sudbury, Massachusetts. Increase, Cotton's dad, kind of ping-ponged there, but he was mentioned in the book. He took that book that Caliph wrote that tore up his son, and he burned it really publicly in Harvard Yard to, kind of stand in solidarity with his son. He died in August 23rd in 1723 after 3 weeks of bladder failure, buried in Copp's Hill next to his son. William Phipps, the governor, the big dog, he caused a serious stir with his objection and eventual pardoning of all the accused. He was recalled to England and arrested on kind of faked, made-up charges of trying to avoid paying a customs money that he was owed when he came back. And he made a particular enemy in Stoughton. He died shortly thereafter, February 18th, 1595, with a fever that he got while he was imprisoned in England. So he got recalled to England to kind of answer for what was going on. They needed a reason to jail him. They jailed him over this customs money that was not a real thing. And while in jail, he caught a fever, and he eventually died from that. William Stoughton, the bastard of this story, he was so geared up for everybody. He had 8 graves dug for the last 8 people that were meant to be hung while the trials were still going on. And Phipps cleared all 8 of them, which led Stoughton to storm out of the court. He had a hissy fit, stormed out of the court because he didn't get to hang these people. This guy never once admitted that anything he had done during the trials was an error in regards to spectral evidence or otherwise. He completely, fully believed they were in the right, that they were putting witches away. And I think he was a bit of a sadist. I think he was a sick fuck. He died at home in Dorchester, 1701, and he's buried in the Dorchester North Burying Ground. Samuel Sewell, the guy I mentioned who did have regrets by the end, in 1725 published Talitha Kumi, which refers to the rights of women. He vocally regretted and repented his involvement in the trial. I told you earlier that he was super liberal. He put out The Selling of Joseph, which was very abolitionist, very anti-slavery. In the 5 years after the trials, 2 of his daughters and mother-in-law died, and a wife gave birth to a stillborn son. He believed this to be his punishment from God for his involvement on the council during the Salem trials. He died New Year's Day, 1730, age 77, and he's buried at Boston's Granary Burying Ground. That's the overall story. So what we have is people who are under this, there's obviously the screenplay, the book, and the movie, The Crucible. Why is it called The Crucible? I kind of like to think that it's called The Crucible because of a melting together of all these different components, right? Maybe that's not at all what was it Hawthorne was putting together. I like to think it is. You got ghost stories, witch stories, stories about the conflicts with the natives and the difficulty of settling in the new world. You have rumor and these hangings and these tortures and these crushings and all these terrible things that are going on at the same time, all happening at once. And it's forcing, it's pressing, it's squeezing out this one result. And that's why I think this story is so interesting. This kind of thing is not unique to religion. It's not unique to Western or Eastern society. There's the Red Scare and McCarthyism in the mid 20th century. Mass hysteria in both. One was a cold spiritual war. The other was a geopolitical Cold War. The Salem trials and McCarthyism both relied on rumor and lack of credible evidence, like association, disagreements, and lies. Both faced the accused of social ostracization, job loss, property loss. Even if the accusations were false, it just didn't matter. You would have an asterisk put next to your name. Accusations were often accepted without due process or the opportunity for the accused to address their accuser. Just you didn't get a chance. Both saw retrospective regret and withdraw as to the harm of both. The harm greatly outweighed any benefit. And that's a uniquely human trait, which I think is really interesting. And that also ties into the war on terror in the early 2000s. It's the same fucking thing. This is not, this is the result of abuse of power. And I think that's really what, from the Inquisition through Henry, through Salem, through McCarthyism, through the Bush era, it's all that. It's the overreach and overextent of power. One thing I do want to get out of the way before anybody brings it up is there's a theory about ergot poisoning. For anybody who doesn't know, in 1976, Linda R. Caporeal hypothesized in a publication in Science magazine that ergot tainted rye may have been the source of the accusations and bewitchment that started the hysteria. Symptoms when you have ergot poisoning or ergotism is like a crawling sensation on the skin, tingling in the fingers, vertigo, tinnitus, headaches, hallucinations, painful muscular contractions, vomiting, all this stuff. And she hypothesized that rye could have gotten tainted with ergot in Salem. People were eating this and blah, blah, blah. The issue with that is it wouldn't be based on like 4 young girls. Cause like if people are eating bread, everybody's eating bread. There's not like food to go around that you can be picky about. Everybody's eating the same thing. So everybody would have had it. It also would have been present household to household, right? It wouldn't have been like one person in one house. It would have been the whole household would have had these symptoms. And the convulsive nature of ergotism is usually accompanied and found in people with a vitamin A deficiency, but farm people who have access to dairy and eggs most likely would not have this deficiency. Anthropologist H. Sidke notes that ergotism had been known for centuries and symptoms like that would have been recognized, in the first place. Like a doctor, that Dr. Briggs in the beginning, he would have been like, oh, this is that. So that's just a nice theory. And I remember I heard about it when I was in college and I thought that was interesting, but it's most likely not what happened. And that's kind of it. That's kind of the whole story of what I like about the Salem witch trials and the witchcraft of the fear of witchcraft in the Christian mind of the New World. You guys know I love the New World and I love the new meetings of cultures and clashes and ideas and stuff like that. So I hope you enjoyed that. Again, I wanted that to be a bite-sized delivery of this entire story, and I hope that it is palatable in that way. This one was a little different than the first one, and I appreciate you coming along for the ride. Just about 2 hours, which seems like an adequate length of time. I'm going to have, there's a video component for this, as I'm sure you've seen, as well as on the YouTube. I am open to ideas for future episodes. If there's something that you are particularly interested in, please feel free to comment below. Feel free to send me a message on Instagram. Feel free to convey that to me any way you can, and I would love to hear about it. And until next time, thank you very much. And I'll see you guys for episode 3 of Cast in Stone whenever it does come out. Bye.